A devastating school bus accident leaves children injured and lives lost. Chaos erupts on the highway, with police officers scrambling to control the scene. But when Donald Trump arrives, his fury knows no bounds. Surrounded by flashing lights and broken hearts, he confronts the officers with intense anger, demanding answers and accountability. As investigations unfold, shocking truths about negligence emerge, turning grief into a relentless fight for justice that will change everything. What happened that day was just the beginning. Because when lives are lost, justice demands action. It was a rainy afternoon when the unthinkable happened. The familiar yellow school bus, filled with children returning home from school, veered off course on a slick, treacherous highway. The driver tried to regain control, but it was too late. With a screech of metal and a violent crash, the bus overturned, sending debris flying in every direction. Onlookers who were passing by froze in horror as they watched the twisted wreckage. The flashing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles painted the road in a chaotic hue. 3 children, no older than 10, lay motionless on the road, their small bodies crushed under the weight of the tragedy. Others, too hurt to move, screamed for help. Amid the chaos, Donald Trump was driving nearby when he received the news. His heart sank as he rushed toward the scene, unable to fathom the extent of the damage. When he arrived, the sight of the injured children shattered him. He stepped out of his car, his face pale, but the fury building inside him could no longer be contained. As he approached the scene, 10 police officers stood in a tense huddle, unsure of how to proceed. Some were too afraid to act. Others seemed overwhelmed by the situation. Trump stormed up to them, his jaw clenched in anger. "Why isn't anyone helping these kids?" he shouted, his voice booming over the roar of emergency sirens. The officers exchanged nervous glances, but Trump wasn't waiting for an answer. "This is an emergency, and you're standing around like this is a normal day," he continued, his voice filled with frustration. "You need to act now!" His outburst drew the attention of everyone nearby. The officers, stunned by his intensity, stood, frozen, caught between their duty and Trump's unrelenting anger. The tragedy unfolding before them was now a test of their response, and Trump wasn't about to let them fail. The rain continued to pour, making the scene even more chaotic as the emergency teams struggled to get the children to safety. But Trump wasn't just watching. He was seething, unable to contain the anger that had been building up inside him. His eyes locked onto the police officers, still standing around in confusion and indecision. One officer stepped forward, his uniform soaked through, his face pale with the gravity of the situation. "Sir, we're doing everything we can," he said, his voice shaking. Trump didn't even give him a chance to finish. "Everything you can?" he thundered, his voice echoing in the stillness of the wet highway. "There are children dying out there, and you're standing here making excuses." The officer flinched, but it wasn't just his words that caused him to shrink back. It was the sheer intensity of Trump's presence. It was clear that the frustration and anger that Trump felt weren't just directed at the police. They were a reflection of a deeper fury at the entire system, the system that had failed these children. He turned to the wrecked school bus in the background, its windows shattered and twisted metal now a twisted reminder of the destruction. "Look at that bus! Look at what's happened," Trump continued, pointing toward the wreckage. "Those kids should be in school right now, not fighting for their lives." The officers stood silent, their hands twitching in uncertainty. They had been trained to respond, to save lives, but in the chaos of this horrific accident, they had faltered. They had failed. The tension in the air was palpable, the flashing lights and sirens now a blur of red and blue. But in the midst of it all, Trump's fury burned brighter than ever. "Get your act together," he barked. "These kids deserve better than this." Just then, a paramedic rushed toward Trump, pulling him back from the officers. "Sir, we need you to step aside. We're doing everything we can," the paramedic urged, but Trump pushed him away. "No, I won't stand here while kids are dying," Trump shot back, his voice unwavering. His eyes were wild with anger, the overwhelming frustration of the situation driving him to the edge. It was then that the officer, whose face had been clouded with doubt, finally spoke up. "We're trying, Mr. Trump. We're trying to save them," he said, his voice firming up. Trump's eyes softened, just slightly, but his anger was far from gone. "Well, you better do more than try," he snapped. "These children are counting on you." As the officers scrambled into action, Trump stood back, his gaze still fixed on the children being carried away on stretchers. The adrenaline had faded, but the anger remained, burning as fiercely as the flashing emergency lights in the background. There was no going back now. The damage had been done, and all Trump could do was watch as the aftermath of the tragedy unfolded before him. The cold rain continued to pour, soaking everyone to the bone as emergency workers scrambled to tend to the injured children. Trump, still visibly agitated, stood near the scene, unable to tear his eyes away from the wreckage of the school bus. The flashing lights from the police cars and ambulances reflected off the wet asphalt, casting a surreal glow over the scene. As the children were loaded into ambulances, some of them still unconscious, Trump's thoughts raced. He couldn't help but wonder. What went wrong? Why had the police officers been so slow to respond? Why hadn't anyone taken charge sooner? He walked back to the group of officers who were now in full motion, directing traffic and attempting to secure the area. The rage he had felt earlier had simmered down, replaced by a profound sense of disappointment. "What happened here today?" Trump began, his voice quieter now but still carrying an edge, "was a failure. A failure to act when those children needed it most." One of the officers, a veteran on the force, stepped forward. "Sir, we were doing our best. We didn't expect such a severe crash." He trailed off, his words heavy with regret. Trump's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it looked like he might snap again. But then his expression softened, just slightly. "I know you didn't expect this," he said, his voice low but firm. "None of us did. But that's the point. You need to be prepared for anything. And when the moment came, you weren't ready." The officer swallowed hard, looking down at his feet. It wasn't easy for anyone to hear. It wasn't easy for Trump either. He wasn't one to sugarcoat things, but he wasn't one to be cruel either. The situation had demanded swift action, and the officers had faltered when it mattered most. As the last of the children was loaded into the ambulance, Trump turned to face the scene one last time. His gaze lingered on the twisted remains of the bus, the silence of the aftermath sinking in. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a wake-up call. "I want answers," Trump said, his voice growing more serious. "I want to know what went wrong, why it happened, and what we're going to do to make sure it never happens again. Those children didn't deserve this." The officers nodded silently, their faces grim. It was clear that this was a moment of reckoning for everyone involved. The accident had exposed cracks in the system, and it was now up to them to fix it, before another tragedy like this could unfold. Trump walked away, his mind heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The anger that had consumed him earlier had dissipated, replaced by a resolve. He would make sure that the families of those children got the justice they deserved. The tragedy wouldn't be forgotten. Not by him, and not by anyone else. The days that followed the tragic school bus crash were a blur of grief, questions, and mounting pressure. News outlets across the country covered the horrific accident, with reports detailing the wreckage, the injured children, and the heroic efforts of emergency responders. But the story didn't end there. For Donald Trump, the tragedy remained at the forefront of his mind. The anger he had felt on that rainy afternoon had not been quelled. He spent days in meetings with officials, demanding accountability. "I won't let this go," he repeatedly stated, his voice sharp with determination. "This cannot be swept under the rug." The investigation into the accident began almost immediately. Police officers, including those who had been on the scene, were interviewed, their actions scrutinized for any lapses in protocol. The school bus driver was questioned too, but it soon became clear that the crash had been caused by more than just a simple error of judgment. The weather conditions had been brutal that day, rain pouring heavily, making the roads slippery and dangerous. But the conditions weren't enough to absolve the authorities of their responsibility. The officers on duty had failed to act swiftly, and the bus driver had not properly checked his vehicle before setting off. As the investigation unfolded, evidence began to emerge pointing to a series of failures. One officer, who had been present at the scene, was found to have hesitated in calling for backup, unsure of how to handle the situation. Another officer had been distracted by the chaos, unsure of how to prioritize the injured children. The public outcry grew louder. "Why wasn't this handled better?" people demanded. "How could they let it get this far?" Trump, who had made it clear from the beginning that he wouldn't back down, was determined to get answers. He demanded a full investigation into the police department's actions. He also called for greater scrutiny of the school bus company, questioning whether proper safety measures were in place. "We need to ensure this never happens again," Trump declared at a press conference. "The families of those children deserve justice, and we will hold everyone accountable." The families of the victims were devastated, but they found some small solace in the fact that the investigation was being taken seriously. Trump's outburst had shaken the system into action, and for the first time, they felt like they were being heard. As the investigation continued, the officers involved in the incident were placed under internal review. Some were reassigned, while others faced disciplinary actions. The bus driver, too, would be held accountable for failing to take proper precautions before the trip. But despite the measures being taken, the grief of the families remained. For Trump, the fight wasn't over. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he promised, his voice resolute. "These children's lives won't be forgotten. We will make sure of that." Weeks passed, and the weight of the tragedy continued to haunt the community. The investigation had uncovered a web of negligence, miscommunication, and oversight, but it hadn't brought the children back. The pain of their families was still fresh, and no amount of accountability could heal the broken hearts. Donald Trump's role in the aftermath remained prominent. His outburst on the day of the crash had sparked action, but he knew the work was far from finished. Justice isn't just about what happens in a courtroom. It's about change, he had told reporters during one of his many press conferences, and he wasn't backing down. Trump had pushed for not only stricter safety regulations for school buses, but also a review of emergency response protocols for accidents involving children. He wanted to ensure that no other family would have to endure the same heartbreak. But the fight wasn't without opposition. Many in the police force felt that Trump's criticism had been too harsh, that it hadn't taken into account the difficulties officers faced on the ground. Some even felt that his anger had undermined their authority, putting them on the defensive. But Trump remained steadfast. The system failed those kids, and the system has to change. His voice was unwavering, and as the weeks went by, his determination only grew stronger. Behind the scenes, The families of the victims were becoming more vocal. They gathered together, speaking out about their pain and demanding that something be done. The community rallied around them, and the pressure on the authorities mounted. In private meetings, Trump worked with lawmakers, pushing for new legislation that would tighten the rules governing school bus safety, driver qualifications, and emergency response times. One day, Trump gathered with the families of the children who had been lost in the crash. He listened as they shared their grief, their hopes for justice, and their desire for meaningful change. The room was filled with raw emotion, and for a moment, Trump's usual bravado softened. He understood their pain, their need for something positive to come from this tragedy. "We're going to make sure this never happens again," Trump promised, his voice low but determined. "Not on my watch." The legislation he had pushed for was finally making its way through Congress. It included stronger regulations for school bus maintenance, mandatory training for drivers, and new safety measures designed to prevent accidents. It also called for better coordination between police, fire, and emergency medical services to ensure faster responses in the event of a crash. Despite the progress, the loss still hung heavy. The families of the children killed in the crash would never be the same, but the changes being put in place gave them a glimmer of hope. They knew their fight had led to something bigger, a movement that would save lives in the future. And for Trump, it wasn't about politics or public image. It was about making a difference. The battle wasn't just over what had happened. It was about preventing another tragedy like this from ever occurring again. As the community began to heal, the legacy of the crash and the changes that followed would serve as a reminder. When tragedy strikes, it's not enough to just grieve. It's essential to demand action. And in the end, action was what had mattered most. Months passed, and the city, though forever scarred by the tragedy, slowly began to heal. The families of the children lost in the crash found solace in knowing that their voices had been heard, that their fight for justice had led to something meaningful. The pain of losing their loved ones would never fully fade, but they knew their loss had sparked real change. Donald Trump, though his involvement had been controversial, had succeeded in pushing through critical reforms. The new school bus safety laws had been enacted, and drivers were now required to undergo more rigorous training. Regular inspections ensured that buses were in optimal condition, and emergency response teams had updated protocols, ready to act more swiftly in future accidents. The families and the public saw the fruits of their struggle as the new legislation was celebrated as a major step toward protecting children across the country. News outlets hailed it as a victory for safety and accountability, and while some criticized Trump's blunt approach, even his detractors couldn't deny the positive changes that had come as a result of his involvement. As the years went by, the memory of the children lost that fateful day remained etched in the minds of those who had lived through it. But thanks to the hard work of many, the accident became a turning point, a lesson in the importance of never backing down in the face of injustice. Trump, too, reflected on the aftermath. Though his anger had been raw and his methods often controversial, the outcome was undeniable. "Change doesn't come easy," he had said in a final statement, "but sometimes it's worth the fight." The families, forever changed by the loss of their children, took comfort in the knowledge that their loved ones had not died in vain. Their struggle had led to safer buses, faster response times, and a system that would no longer turn a blind eye to the needs of those most vulnerable. And as for the community, the accident became a symbol of resilience, proof that even in the darkest moments, change was possible. They would remember the children lost, but they would also honor them by ensuring that no more would suffer the same fate. In the end, it wasn't just about the tragedy. It was about the lasting impact of collective action and the strength that came from standing together. The legacy of that day would live on in every new law, every safety measure, and in the hearts of the families whose pain had sparked a nation to take action.